Finally, I will be presenting my results and discussion sections of my research project. First, I wanted to provide an overview of the characteristics of the respondents in the study. For employment status, about 45% of the respondents worked full-time jobs, and the second highest is retired, and it was at almost 24%. The next biggest employment status was a homemaker, which was at 14%. As for the respondents, if they owned or rented their home, majority of them at 72.6% own their home. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, it's important to know whether or not whether or not they owned or rented their home, because homeowners tend to have a larger stake in the community as opposed to renters, which have more of a it's easier for them to move and not really make those connections with their community members. As for the sex of the respondents, 59.1% of the respondents, so more than half of the respondents were female, and about 40% of the respondents were male. Excuse me. As for race of the respondents, a little over half of the respondents were Black, and the second highest race for the respondents was white. For my research project, I conducted chi-square tests for all 4 of my independent variables against my dependent variable. The first I will be discussing will be the police contacts versus the effectiveness of community policing. And for these variables, there is a significant interaction between the two, and majority of the respondents perceive the area to be better without the contact of the police compared to the other respondents. Even though these variables have a significant relationship with one another, it suggests that the individuals perceive the police as unnecessary to make their area better. And the column that I'm referring to is this one right here, which has 50.7% of the respondents that viewed that the area got better without the help of the police and without the contact of them. Same in the no problem section. About 47% viewed that the area was about the same and didn't view it to be such a big issue that there wasn't any police contact. As opposed to the some problem section, this is the area where the respondents perceive that there is some sort of issue with the lack of police contact. And about 40% viewed that the area got worse, and they also viewed that police should make more contacts with the residents in the area. As for the big problem section, this is the section that the respondents perceived that it is a big problem that the police aren't making any contacts with community members in the area. And about 34% of the respondents in this section perceived that the area that they lived in got worse, and also viewed that there needs to be more police contact. My second chi-square test is calling the police and effectiveness of community policing. Again, these two variables have a significant interaction with one another, and majority of the respondents perceived the area about the same, and they viewed that calling the police was worth it as opposed to other respondents. And the respondents that I'm referring to is this column right here that has 70.3%. And again, these respondents viewed that the area stayed about the same, but when they did need the police, they did think it was worth it to involve them. As for the mostly true section, that's the respondents that perceived that it wasn't really worth the hassle to call the police, and from my interpretation, I would perceive that as those respondents not thinking that the effectiveness of the police in their area isn't really worth it, and they probably perceive that the police aren't really going to help them with whatever issue they have. And I think that is reflected with this column right here, with 35% of the respondents viewed that the area got worse, and they also just didn't think it was worth calling the police. My third chi-square test is with the variable help each other or don't, and it's against the effectiveness of community policing. And like the first two, these two variables do have a significant relationship with one another, and majority of the respondents perceived that people do help each other out in the area, and they saw that the area stayed about the same. And since this variable is measuring collective efficacy, I think it's a bit odd that even though the respondents in the area did think that their fellow community members helped out and the area stayed about the same, from my understanding, I believe that a higher collective efficacy would produce results of improvement in the community, And so for it to stay about the same, it is a bit odd. For the respondents that believed that the community members went their own way and didn't help out, they saw that the area did get worse. And I think it shows again that lower collective efficacy, these residents aren't really bonding with one another and would affect community policing. My last chi-square test is about whether or not residents work together, and it's against the effectiveness of community policing. And just like the previous three, these variables do have a significant interaction with one another. And majority of the respondents perceive that the area stayed about the same, but people worked with one another compared to the other respondents. And again, that column that I'm referring to is 68.6, and those are the respondents that did think the area stayed about the same, but they, again, like the previous variable, they believe that people do help each other and work together to solve problems in the community. For the mostly false section, about almost 39% of the respondents viewed that people didn't really work together and the area got worse, which is similar to the previous slide, which discusses that the lower collective efficacy and the area gets worse. And I think collective efficacy does play a role in community policing. So, is my hypothesis supported? I do think there is some support, but I don't think my hypothesis was completely supported through my project. I think my interpretations of the results found that police effectiveness and collective efficacy have an impact, but it was a bit unclear. Again, back to my collective efficacy ones, which were the previous two slides, it shows that the community does view, well, majority of the respondents from the project did see that their community members helped out, but it didn't really seem to have that much of an impact in the areas. As for the police effectiveness variables, which are the first two, which is calling the police and the police contacts, it seemed that majority of the respondents viewed the areas getting better, but it didn't seem like they really believed that police were making enough contact, which just shows that the police in the area aren't being as effective as they should be. As for calling the police, there was positive results that majority of community members did think that it was worth calling the police, which does show support for police effectiveness with community policing. So again, I feel like my hypothesis has some support, but I don't think it's completely supported. As for discussion, I found two potential limitations from this project. The first is that the year that the study was collected, and I think this goes along with future research that I think future researchers should obtain more recent data just to see whether or not there's any difference or any changes. As for my second potential limitation, I think it's generalizability. I think since the data set that I used only took place in 2 Baltimore cities, I think future researchers should expand that and focus on several different cities, whether within the same state or within several different states or a couple different states. As for the implications for the real world, again, as I had mentioned earlier, since this information involves police agencies and whether or not they want to implement community policing, I think it's important to have the most accurate information out there so that when police agencies are working with their budget and determining whether or not they want to implement a new policing strategy, they can figure out whether or not they want to implement community policing. And thank you for listening to me talk about my research project on community policing and whether or not police effectiveness and collective efficacy have an impact. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask and I will make sure to answer them. Thank you.